Behavioral ecology. Lorenz, Tinbergen, and von Frisch shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1973, attesting to the impact and importance of the discipline which they founded, ethology. Even so, both the methodologies and theories of this research area were criticized in the mid to late 20th century, the mid to late 1900s. Many scientists were uncomfortable with the ethologists' focus on FAPs and the fact that behavior of individual organisms was frequently examined in isolation. Many animals live in social groups, so any theoretical account of behavior should include social interactions. These ideas were promoted by Wilson, 1975, the founder of sociobiology, a field of study in which the principles of population biology and evolutionary theory are applied to social organizations, who explained many human activities such as cooperation, altruism, and sibling rivalries as adaptive traits. Sociobiologists made the point that humans, like animals, are always in competition for limited resources, e.g., food, territories, or mates. Behaviors that provide a competitive advantage in these situations will increase an individual's chance of surviving and reproducing. Put another way, behavior facilitates the preservation of an individual's genes within a population, an idea that was put forward in the highly successful book, The Selfish Gene, Dawkins, 1976. The rise of sociobiology coincided with scientific analyses of animal behavior within an economic framework. Several researchers in ecology, the scientific study of interactions among organisms and their environment, proposed that activities, such as foraging or hunting, reflected an internal process that weighed the costs and benefits of a particular behavior. Emlyn, 1966. The costs associated with foraging include energy output, potential dangers that animals may encounter during their search, as well as time away from other fitness-related activities, such as reproduction. Behaviors that maximize gains and minimize costs were adaptive. As with physiological traits, these were more likely to be passed on to the next generation. The increasing focus on the evolution of social behavior, combined with an economic analysis of behavior, led to the development of a new discipline. Behavioral ecology is defined as the scientific study of the evolutionary basis for animal behavior due to ecological pressures. Danchin et al., 2008. Behavior ecologists study the interaction between organisms and their environment, and how these interactions result in differential survival and reproduction. The field solidified as a separate discipline with the 1978 publication of Behavioral Ecology, an Evolutionary Approach. 3 more editions of this multi-author work appeared over the next 20 years. Behavioral ecology is also distinguished by the use of genetic markers to trace heritability of behavioral traits, a technique that was not available to early ethologists. Importantly, these tools have provided new insight into social interactions. For example, co-parenting was often taken as evidence for paternity, but genetic analyses revealed that socially monogamous species often engage in extra-pair copulations. That is, males of many different species help to raise non-biological offspring, a fact that has implications for understanding the evolution of social behaviors. Today, behavioral ecology is viewed as an offshoot of ethology, with an increased emphasis on ultimate explanations of behavior. The field arose, partially, as a reaction to the focus on proximate causes of behavior that characterized many early studies in ethology, e.g., imprinting by chicks. Although Tinbergen's 4 questions of ethology gave equal weight to both ultimate and proximate explanations of behavior, behavioral ecology assigns a higher priority to the former, ultimate explanations. According to a contemporary text, Danchin et al., 2008, physiological and developmental mechanisms underlying a behavior can be understood only within the context of evolution and function. Despite a different theoretical focus, ethologists and behavioral ecologists investigate the same phenomenon, natural behaviors, and frequently work within the same research unit. so the distinction between the two disciplines is often difficult to establish. Emergence of comparative cognition. Comparative cognition grew out of two traditional sciences, psychology and zoology, or, more specifically, behaviorism and behavioral ecology. The two disciplines developed and worked, more or less, independently for over 50 years. In many cases, scientists in each field would be interested in exactly the same question, e.g., how do animals transmit information to each other? But there was little crosstalk between them in the initial part of the 20th century, in the initial part of the 1900s. Communication increased in the 1960s and 1970s when it became apparent that researchers in the two areas were frequently studying the same phenomenon. The book Animal Behavior, a synthesis of ethology and comparative psychology, Hind, 1970, provided clear indication that the goals and interests of the two disciplines were complementary. In some cases, experimental psychology and behavioral ecology were merging into a single field of behavioral research that was no longer distinguished by methodological or theoretical differences. Many psychologists began to conduct field work, and behavioral ecologists frequently brought their studies into controlled laboratory settings. More importantly, there was a growing recognition that a complete understanding of any behavior or cognitive process requires explanations in terms of both proximate and ultimate causes. This resulting synergy of theoretical perspectives is reflected in the contemporary field of comparative cognition. A guiding premise in this discipline is that understanding why a behavior occurs is informed by understanding how it occurs, and vice versa. Put another way, cognitive processes are controlled by an interaction between factors in an animal's environment and biological predispositions to behave in a particular way. For example, the way in which experience may alter innate spatial navigation abilities will be discussed in Chapter 7, and the role of biological predispositions in learned associations will be discussed in Chapter 4. A focus on cognitive processes. Comparative cognition, as a distinct discipline, arose in the mid-20th century, the mid-1900s, with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection providing a theoretical framework, and both behaviorism and behavioral ecology providing methodological tools. The emphasis on cognition arose within the field of psychology, which underwent an important shift in emphasis during the mid-1900s. The impetus for these changes came from two other disciplines, linguistics, the study of the nature and structure of human language, and computer science, the study of computer design and computational theories. Linguists had obvious links to psychologists, particularly those who were studying language acquisition. According to Skinner, a renowned behavioral psychologist, learning to speak was no different than learning any other behavior. It could be explained by the same principles that govern rat lever pressing in the lab, 1957. Not everyone agreed. Noam Chomsky, a prominent linguist at the time, wrote a scathing attack on Skinner's piece, 1959, in which he criticized Skinner's inconsistent and vague use of the term reinforcement and argued further that language acquisition could not be explained by stimulus-response learning. Chomsky pointed out that children all over the world master language and the rules of grammar at roughly the same age, with the exception of very rare and tragic cases involving social isolation. See Curtis, 1977, for review. This amazing universal ability could only be explained by innate mental processes that structured language learning. Chomsky's criticism of Skinner's paper, and the field of behaviorism in general, was timely. Many people, including scientists working within the field, were disillusioned with behaviorism and its apparent inability to explain more complex behaviors. During the same period, computer science was developing as a discipline led by the pioneering work of Alan Turing. Turing designed and built some of the first computers, but his interest in these systems extended far beyond the mechanics of how they work. He wrote numerous papers on how information processing occurs in both humans and machines, pointing out the similarities between the two. One of his most influential articles, 1950, equated information processing with thinking, and raised the question, can machines think? Turing's influence was widespread. Over the next 2 decades, 20 years, computer science and the study of artificial intelligence expanded rapidly at many academic institutions. Scientific advances in this area helped to establish the study of information processing as a credible endeavor. Psychologists who were frustrated by trying to explain all behavior without reference to hypothetical constructs quickly embraced computational models of thinking, reasoning, and decision-making, topics that were seldom discussed by behaviorists. Thus, the growing interest in cognition within psychology was both a reaction to the limitations of behaviorism and an acceptance of ideas put forth by linguists and computer scientists. Some texts describe the shift in the late 1950s and early 1960s as a cognitive revolution, in that many tenets of behaviorism were rejected and replaced with discussions and theorizing of mental processes and representations. Others argue that the shift in research focus was an evolution, not a revolution, pointing out that cognitive research continued throughout the early and mid-1900s, even if it took a backseat to the more dominant behaviorist work. For example, the first half of the 20th century, the first half of the 1900s, witnessed reports of tool use, imitation, and spatial maps in animals, most of which were discussed as higher mental processes. Whether it is called a revolution or an evolution, psychology did undergo a change of emphasis, and the modern-day field of comparative cognition is steeped within this academic environment. The legacy of behaviorism is still apparent in comparative cognition, with an emphasis on quantifiable measures of behavior and an attempt to control extraneous variables, i.e., methodological behaviorism. Cognition in an evolutionary framework. It should now be clear that the emergence of comparative cognition can be traced back to the synthesis of behaviorism and behavioral ecology, along with the growth of cognitive science. This convergence of ideas coincided with scientific discoveries in other fields, specifically molecular biology, that led to a widespread acceptance of evolutionary theory, see Box 1.3. This provided a theoretical framework for the burgeoning field of comparative cognition, in that research in this area is guided by the premise that cognitive processes, like physical traits, are shaped by natural selection. Darwin himself promoted the idea. Although he did not use the term cognition, he believed in the continuity of complex thought processes across species. Box 1.3, a primer on genetics. When Darwin proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection, he had no means to explain how heritable traits are passed from parent to offspring, nor did he know the work of his contemporary, Gregor Mendel, 1822 to 1884, who had identified the laws of heredity by studying the transmission of observable characteristics, such as shape or color, in pea plants. Mendel suggested that these independent traits are passed from one generation to another in independent packages, which are now referred to as genes. Mendel's work was rediscovered decades after his death, and his theories of inheritance were confirmed by advances in molecular biology, particularly the description of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA structure, by the Nobel laureates James Watson and Francis Crick, 1953. DNA forms long strands called chromosomes that are present in each cell in the body. Chromosomes contain 4 different nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, that recur in various sequences across the entire strand. A gene is a specific section of the chromosome made up of some combination of the 4 nucleotides. Genes have many forms, also called alleles, with a specific gene form being defined by the nucleotide sequence of the area it occupies on the chromosome. So, the gene is a particular location on the chromosome, and variations in the nucleotide sequence within that location are the gene alleles, figure 1.8. Genes produce proteins, which build the physical body, and different alleles, i.e. nucleotide sequence, of the same gene account for variations in physical traits, such as the presence of dimples or freckles. Importantly, There is not a one-to-one mapping of gene to trait. Even simple features like eye color are produced by a combination of 3 or more genes. Behavioral and cognitive differences are even more complex, even if these can sometimes be linked to a cluster of genes within a certain region of the chromosome. Figure 1.8. The relationship between deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, genes, and chromosome. Genes are located on specific regions of the chromosome and are made up of a combination of DNA nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay, so in the most zoomed in, you can see DNA has the lines in the middle of the two swirly lines are adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine, A, T, C, and G, and then the gene on itself is in a swirl, and then that gene is in the chromosome, which is a series of long swirls which form an X or a Y. All cells in the body, with the exception of the sex cells, sperm and ova, have 2 sets of chromosomes. In the case of humans, each set of chromosomes has 23, but this number varies across other species. Offspring inherit 1 chromosome set from each parent, so every individual possesses half of their mother's genetic code and half of their father's. If the same allele is inherited from both parents, the individual is homozygous for that particular gene. If not, they are heterozygous for that gene. Sometimes the nucleotide sequence on the chromosomes is altered during transmission, producing genetic variation or mutation. Most of these mutations are undetectable. In rare cases, the mutation is so severe that it causes death at an early stage of development. In other instances, some random genetic variation confers a fitness advantage to the individual, e.g., longer necks in giraffes that allow them to reach the best food, making it more likely that this individual will survive, reproduce, and pass on the gene to their own offspring. Thus, all 3 tenets of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection can be explained by genetic mutations and inheritance. Section 1.2.1. Examining cognition within an evolutionary framework presents a number of challenges. The first is determining how to classify cognition. This textbook provides one perspective, with each chapter presenting and then discussing a different cognitive process. Not everyone would agree with these divisions, or how the material is presented within each chapter, and future scientific advances will likely lead to a restructuring of these categories. Nonetheless, even if they disagree with the specific divisions, most researchers acknowledge that cognition should be viewed as a collection of processes that are characterized by distinct rules of operation rather than a general-purpose operating system. These individual processes interact to control both human and animal behavior, and researchers face the challenge of designing experiments that tap one process or the other. The task becomes even more complicated if the same cognitive process is to be examined in different species. These issues will arise repeatedly throughout the text, frequently with little or no resolution. Once researchers identify a cognitive process that they wish to study, they face the added challenge of determining the adaptive value and evolutionary progression of this process. A premise of the work is that cognition evolved to solve fitness-related problems, but compared to many physical traits, e.g., large wings for migrating birds, it is difficult to determine how a particular cognitive process increased survival and reproduction in ancestral or even contemporary environments. One approach to this problem is to examine whether cognitive abilities of different animals match the ecological constraints of that species. For example, animals that live in social groups would be more likely to survive and reproduce if they cooperated with conspecifics in foraging, hunting, and defending territory. A corollary is that prosocial behaviors will be higher, or at least more complex, as the complexity of a social environment increases. Another approach is to assess whether closely related species exhibit the same or similar cognitive traits. McLean et al., 2012. Closely related species are represented as nearby branches on the phylogenetic tree, see Figure 1.9, indicating that they share a more recent evolutionary ancestor than distantly related species. If cognitive traits are shaped by natural selection, one would expect these to be comparable in closely related species that would have experienced similar evolutionary pressures. Figure 1.9, Schematic of an evolutionary tree. The closer the species are to each other on branches of the tree, the more traits they share. Okay, so one branch looks like humans, great apes, zebras, and then kind of another large branch next to it is birds and lizards, reptiles, and which leads to fishes. And then fishes are related to another big branch, which is got a lot of underwater stuff like crustaceans, mollusks, vertebrates, sponges, and protozoans, and protists, and insects. You can see, for example, great apes and humans are close to each other. And you can also see this is not like a standard tree like we've got. It's a weird one. Here, there's two big sections of it. But you could consider it like two major stalks of the tree.